Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, The Science of the Idea in and for itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion, Encyclopedia Section 21, Metasection B. Thought was described as active. We now, in the second place, consider this thought in its bearings upon objects, or as reflection upon something. In this case, that the universal or product of its operation contains the value of the thing is the essential, inward, and true. In Encyclopedia Section 5, the old belief was quoted that the reality in object, circumstance, or event, the intrinsic worth or essence of the thing on which everything depends, is not a self-evident datum of consciousness, or coincident with the first appearance and impression of the object, that on the contrary, reflection is required in order to discover the real constitution of the object, and that by such reflection it will be ascertained. To reflect is a lesson which even the child has to learn. One of his first lessons is to join adjectives with substantives. This obliges him to attend and distinguish. He has to remember a rule and apply it to the particular case. This rule is nothing but a universal, and the child must see that the particular adapts itself to this universal. In life, again, we have ends to attain, and with regard to these we ponder which is the best way to secure them. The end here represents the universal or governing principle, and we have means and instruments whose action we regulate in conformity to the end. In the same way, reflection is active in questions of conduct. To reflect here means to recollect the right, the duty, the universal which serves as a fixed rule to guide our behavior in the given case. Our particular act must imply and recognize the universal law. We find the same thing exhibited in our study of natural phenomena. For instance, we observe thunder and lightning. The phenomenon is a familiar one, and we often perceive it. But man is not content with a bare acquaintance, or with the fact as it appears to the senses. He would like to get behind the surface, to know what it is, and to comprehend it. This leads him to reflect. He seeks to find out the cause as something distinct from the mere phenomenon. He tries to know the inside in its distinction from the outside, hence the phenomenon becomes double. It splits into inside and outside, into force and its manifestation, into cause and effect. Once more we find the inside or the force identified with the universal and permanent. Not this or that flash of lightning, this or that plant, but that which continues, the same in them all. The sensible appearance is individual and evanescent. The permanent in it is discovered by reflection. Nature shows us a countless number of individual forms and phenomena. Into this variety, we feel a need of introducing unity. We compare, consequently, and try to find the universal of each single case. Individuals are born and perish. The species abides and recurs in them all, and its existence is only visible to reflection. Under the same head fall such laws as those regulating the motions of the heavenly bodies. Today we see the stars here and tomorrow there, and our mind finds something incongruous in this chaos, something in which it can put no faith. Because it believes in order and in a simple, constant, and universal law. Inspired by this belief, the mind has directed its reflection towards the phenomena and learnt their laws. In other words, it has established the movement of the heavenly bodies to be in accordance with a universal law from which every change of position may be known and predicated. The case is the same with the influences which make themselves felt in the infinite complexity of human conduct. There, too, man has the belief in the sway of a general principle. From all these examples, it may be gathered how reflection is always seeking for something fixed and permanent, definite in itself and governing the particulars. This universal, which cannot be apprehended by the senses, counts as the true and essential. Thus, duties and rights are all important in the matter of conduct, and an action is true when it conforms to those universal formulae. In thus characterizing the universal, we become aware of its antithesis to something else. This something else is the merely immediate, outward, and individual, as opposed to the mediate, inward, and universal. The universal does not exist externally to the outward eye as a universal. The kind as kind cannot be perceived. The laws of the celestial motions are not written on the sky. The universal is neither seen nor heard. Its existence is only for the mind. Religion leads us to a universal which embraces all else within itself, to an absolute by which all else is brought into being. And this absolute is an object not of the senses, but of the mind and of thought. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notation, Encyclopedia Section 22, Metasection C. By the act of reflection, something is altered in the way in which the fact was originally presented in sensation, perception, or conception. Thus, as it appears, an alteration of the object must be interposed before its true nature can be discovered. What reflection elicits is a product of our thought. Solon, for instance, grandfather of divine Plato, produced out of his head the laws he gave to the Athenians as king of Athens. This is half of the truth, but we must not on that account forget that the universal, in Solon's case, King Solon's case, the laws, is the very reverse of merely subjective, or fail to note that it is the essential, true, and objective being of things. To discover the truth in things, mere attention is not enough. We must call in the action of our own faculties to transform what is immediate before us. Now, at first sight, this seems an inversion of the natural order, calculated to thwart the very purpose on which knowledge is bent. But the method is not so irrational as it seems. It has been the conviction of every age that the only way of reaching the permanent substratum was to transmute the given phenomenon by means of reflection. In modern times, a doubt has for the first time been raised on this point in connection with the difference alleged to exist between the products of our thought and the things in their own nature. This real nature of things, it is said, is very different from what we make out of them. The divorce between thought and thing is mainly the work of the critical philosophy and runs counter to the conviction of all previous ages that their argument was a matter of course. The antithesis between them is the hinge on which modern philosophy turns. Meanwhile, the natural belief of men gives the lie to it. In common life, we reflect without particularly reminding ourselves that this is the process of arriving at the truth, and we think without hesitation, and in the firm belief that thought coincides with thing. And this belief is of the greatest importance. It marks the diseased state of the age when we see it adopt the despairing creed that our knowledge is only subjective and that beyond this subjective we cannot go. Whereas, rightly understood, truth is objective and ought so to regulate the conviction of every one that the conviction of the individual is stamped as wrong when it does not agree with this rule. Modern views, on the contrary, put great value on the mere fact of conviction and hold that to be convinced is good for its own sake, whatever be the burden of our conviction, there being no standard by which we can measure its truth. We said above that, according to the old belief, it was the characteristic right of the mind to know the truth. If this be so, it also implies that everything we know, both of outward and inward nature, in one word, the objective world, if this be so, it also implies that everything we know, both of outward and inward nature, in one word, the objective world, is in its own self the same as it is in thought, in that to think is to bring out the truth of our object, but it be it what it may. The business of philosophy is only to bring into explicit consciousness what the world in all ages has believed about thought. Philosophy therefore advances nothing new, and our present discussion has led us to a conclusion which agrees with the natural belief of mankind. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for Itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notation, Encyclopedia Section 23, Meta Section D. The real nature of the object is brought to light in reflection, but it is no less true that this exertion of thought is my act. If this be so, the real nature is a product of my mind, in its character of thinking subject, generated by me in my simple universality, self collected and removed from extraneous influences, in one word, in my freedom. Think for yourself is a phrase which people often use as if it had some special significance. The fact is, no man can think for another any more than he can eat or drink for him, and the expression is a pleonasm. I accept the challenge. Pleonasm from Cambridge Dictionary, dictionary.cambridge.org. The use of more words than are needed to express a meaning, done either unintentionally or for emphasis. An example of this An example of pleonasm might be kick it with your feet. There is a looseness in his writing, as in the pleonasm I myself. Compare it with the word tautology, which is the use of two words or phrases that express the same meaning in a way that is unnecessary and usually unintentional. No one talks about creative music because it would be a tautology. try to avoid repetition or tautology. In logic, open parentheses equal, a formal scientific method of examining ideas, close parentheses, comma, a statement that is always true. There are the propositions of science and ordinary language on the one hand, and the tautologies of math and logic on the other. More examples. More often than not, heroic heroes, note the tautology here, have been blessed from the start. As a working mom, there's a tautology. I write whenever I can. The laws of physics are merely useful tautologies. To think is, in fact, ipso facto to be free. For thought as the action of the universal is an abstract relating of self to self, where, being at home with ourselves, and as regards our subjectivity, utterly blank, our consciousness is, in the matter of its contents, only in the fact and in its characteristics. If this be admitted, and if we apply the term humility or modesty to an attitude where our subjectivity is not allowed to interfere by act or quality, it is easy to appreciate the question touching the humility or modesty and pride of philosophy. For in point of contents, thought is only true in proportion as it sinks itself in the facts, and in point of form, it is no private or particular state or act of the subject, but rather that attitude of consciousness where the abstract self, freed from all the special limitations to which its ordinary states or qualities are liable, restricts itself to that universal action in which it is identical with all individuals. In these circumstances, philosophy may be acquitted of the charge of pride. And when divine Aristotle summons the mind to rise to the dignity of that attitude, the dignity he seeks is won by letting slip all our individual opinions and prejudices and submitting to the sway of the fact. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, The Science of the Self in and for Itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notation, Encyclopedia, Section 24. With these explanations and qualifications, thoughts may be termed objective thoughts, among which are also to be included the forms which are more especially discussed in the common logic, where they are usually treated as forms of conscious thought only. Logic, therefore, coincides with metaphysics, the science of things set and held in thoughts, thoughts accredited able to express the essential reality of things. An exposition of the relation in which such forms as notion, judgment, and syllogism stand to others, such as causality, is a matter for the science itself. But this much is evident beforehand. If thought tries to form a notion of things, this notion, as well as its proximate phases, the judgment and syllogism, cannot be composed of articles and relations which are alien and irrelevant to the things. Reflection, it was said above, conducts to the universal of things, which universal is itself one of the constituent factors of a notion. To say that reason or understanding is in the world is equivalent in its import to the phrase objective thought. The latter phrase, however, has the inconvenience that thought is usually confined to express what belongs to the mind or consciousness only, while objective is a term applied, at least primarily, only to the non-mental. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself. Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion, Encyclopedia, Section 24. With these explanations and qualifications, thoughts may be termed objective thoughts, among which are also to be included the forms which are more especially discussed in the common logic, where they are usually treated as forms of conscious thought only. Logic, therefore, coincides with metaphysics, the science of things set and held in thoughts, thoughts accredited able to express the essential reality of things. Infrasection 1. To speak of thought or objective thought as the heart and soul of the world, we may seem to be ascribing consciousness to the things of nature. We feel a certain repugnance against making thought the inward function of things, especially as we speak of thought as marking the divergence of man from nature. It would be necessary, therefore, if we use the term thought at all, to speak of nature as the system of unconscious thought, or to use Schilling's expression, a petrified intelligence. And in order to prevent misconception, thought form or thought type should be substituted for the ambiguous term thought, again, as it relates to nature versus man. From what has been said, the principles of logic are to be sought in a system of thought types or fundamental categories in which the opposition between subjective and objective in its usual sense vanishes. The signification thus attached to thought and its characteristic forms may be illustrated by the ancient Greek saying that
no sigma.
the sound is from translate.google.com. No sigma governs the world, or by our own phrase that reason is in the world, which means that reason is the soul of the world it inhabits, its eminent principle, its most proper and inward nature, its universal. Another illustration is offered by the circumstance that, in speaking of some definite animal, we say it is an animal. Now that the animal, qua animal, cannot be shown, nothing can be pointed out excepting that special animal. Animal, qua, are a conjunction meaning in the capacity of, or as being, for example, he's hard to pin down if you get him on entertainment qua entertainment. So he is hard to pin down if you get him on entertainment in the capacity of entertainment or in the capacity of, or as being entertainment. So if you want to talk about, did you enjoy watching Moon Knight? That recently, as far as the recording goes, the Disney Plus Marvel phenomenon called Moon Knight with uh, Oscar Isaac. Did you enjoy watching Moon Knight? And so the individual here, who is hard to pin down if you get him on entertainment by entertainment, may say, yes, I thought Moon Knight was amazing. But then someone will say, but I thought you didn't like watching television. Oh, why don't? And therefore, while you can pin him down, while you can understand that he liked Moon Knight, he enjoyed it. And if you really listen, especially with an X-ray, it's that he may have thought it exceptional, which is why he watched it, even though he doesn't like watching television. If you want to talk about uh, the television itself or entertainment itself as a medium, no, I'm not a really big fan of entertainment or television or these various services that we were watching, but I really liked Moon Knight. So philosophy allows you to uh, really, if from a questioning standpoint, if you're a journalist, or let's say your mom or dad, and you need to ask your son or daughter a question, and you want to know how their day was. So you first ask, this morning you said you had a math exam. How did it go? Oh, actually, I think it wasn't as best as it could be, but it'll be better next time. Okay. Well, how was your day? Oh, weird question. And they walk away. So they don't want to talk about their day qua their day being a day 24 hours. Did you mean the last 24 hours or this morning? It's only 3 o'clock or 4. I don't know how the rest of the day is going to go. But do you want to know about something about the day? Sure. You remember that I had a math exam, or you remember that your son or daughter had a math exam and you asked about it. And you could extrapolate that, well, that was a big part of their day, at least as you're concerned. And that part of it did not go as well as they hoped, and they hope in the future it'll go better. But their day, their entire day, do you have something specific you know about it? No. So it's hard to pin them down on the entire day. But if you ask about a math exam, you'll get that answer. So this is what qua means, as being, a day versus something that happened today, or maybe even something that happens every day. How was grandpa? How are your bowel movements these days? These days? Well, they're okay. They're working out. Yeah, I had that difficulty before, and yeah, they're fine. Okay. Well, how are you these days? Me? I don't know how to answer that. So these are two different questions, and some people get very annoyed as questioners when they ask generality before a specific. I would argue that unless you are within a litigation practice and you have a particular way of asking, let's say, depositions or questions, ask a specific instead of a universal. As a specific before universal, because if you ask a person like me, how is reading? I read before this part 3, which is the philosophy of mind, and I finished that part before starting the science of logic, and I still haven't found the text for the science of nature, the philosophy of nature by Hegel. So if you ask me, how's your Hegel reading going first? I would say it is difficult to tell because there are parts I don't have. So I'll give you something more specific. If you ask me, how is your philosophy of mind going? You know what? I finished it. And I finished recording it, and I put it on Facebook or put it on YouTube. And if you ask, how is your reading of the logic of Hegel going, or the science of logic, I would say, so far, I think it's going well. So it may be more difficult to pin down the entire reading or a reading that I'm in the middle of, or not even in the middle at the very beginning, versus something that I've completed. So qua is used that way, and it teaches you how to ask questions. So back to the reading. Now, the animal, qua animal, the animal being an animal, cannot be shown. Nothing can be pointed out excepting some special animal. Animal qua animal does not exist. It is merely the universal nature of the individual animals, whilst each existing animal is a more concretely defined and particularized thing. But to be an animal, the law of kind, which is the universal in this case, is the property of the particular animal and constitutes its definite essence. Take away from the dog its animality, and it becomes impossible to say what it is. All things have a permanent inward nature, as well as an outward existence. They live and die, arise and pass away. But their essential and universal part is the kind, and this means much more than something common to them all. If thought is the constitutive substance of eternal things, it is also the universal substance of what is spiritual. In all human perception, thought is present. So too, thought is the universal in all the acts of conception and recollection. In short, in every mental activity, in willing, wishing, and the like. All these faculties are only further specializations of thought. When it is presented in this light, thought has a different part to play from what it has if we speak of a faculty of thought, one among a crowd of other faculties, such as perception, conception, and will, with which it stands on the same level. When it is seen to be the true universal of all that nature and mind contain, it extends into scope far beyond all these, and becomes the basis of everything. From this view of thought, it is its objective meaning as Greek nous. We may next pass to consider the subjective sense of the term. We say first, man is a being that thinks, but we also say at the same time, man is a being that perceives and wills. Man is a thinker and is universal, but he is a thinker only because he feels his own universality. The animal too is by implication universal, but the universal is not consciously felt by it to be universal. It feels only the individual. The animal sees a singular object, for instance, its food or a man. For the animal, all this never goes beyond an individual thing. Similarly, sensation has to do with nothing but singulars, such as this pain or this sweet taste. Nature does not bring its nous into consciousness. It is man who first makes himself double so as to be a universal for a universal. This first happens when man knows that he is I. By the term I mean myself, a single and altogether determinate person. And yet I really utter nothing peculiar to myself, for everyone else is an I or ego, and when I call myself I, though I indubitably meaning the single person myself, I express a thorough universal. I, therefore, is mere being for self, in which everything peculiar or marked is renounced and buried out of sight. It is as it were the ultimate and unanalyzable point of consciousness. We may say I and thought are the same, or more definitely, I is thought as a thinker. What I have in my consciousness is for me. I is the vacuum or receptacle for anything and everything, for which everything is and which stores up everything in itself. Every man is a whole world of conceptions that lie buried in the night of the ego. It follows that the ego is the universal in which we leave aside all that is particular, and in which, at the same time, all the particulars have a latent existence. In other words, it is not a mere universality and nothing more, but the universality which includes in it everything. Commonly, we use the word I without attaching much importance to it, nor is it an object of study except to philosophical analysis. In the ego, we have thought before us in its utter purity. While the brute cannot say I, Man can, because it is his nature to think. Now, in the ego, there are a variety of contents derived both from within and from without, and according to the nature of these contents, our state may be described as perception, or conception, or reminiscence, but in all of them the I is found, or in them all thought is present. Man, therefore, is always thinking. Even in his perceptions, if he observes anything, he always observes it as a universal, fixes on a single point which he places in relief, thus withdrawing his attention from other points, and takes it as abstract and universal, even if the universality be only in form. In the case of our ordinary conceptions, two things may happen. Either the contents are molded by thought, but not the form, or the form belongs to thought and not the contents. In using such terms, for instance, an anger, in using such terms, for instance, as anger, rose, hope, I am speaking of things which I have learnt in the way of sensation. But I express these contents in a universal mode, that is, in the form of thought. I have left out much that is particular and given the contents in their generality, but still the contents remain sense derived. On the other hand, when I represent God, the content is undeniably a product of pure thought, but the form still retains the sensuous limitations which it has as I find it immediately present in myself. In these generalized images, the content is not merely and simply sensible, as it is in a visual inspection, but either the content is sensuous and the form appertains to thought, or vice versa. In the first case, the material is given to us, and our thought supplies the form. In the second case, the content which has its source in thought is by means of the form turned into a something given, which accordingly reaches the mind from without. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself. Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion. Encyclopedia section 24. With these explanations and qualifications, thoughts may be termed objective thoughts, among which are also to be included the forms which are more especially discussed in the common logic, where they are usually treated as forms of conscious thought only. Logic therefore coincides with metaphysics, the science of things set and held in thoughts, thoughts accredited able to express the essential reality of things. Infrasection 2. Logic is the study of thought pure and simple, or of the pure thought forms. In the ordinary sense of the term, by thought we generally represent to ourselves something more than simple and unmixed thought. We mean some thought, the material of which is from experience, whereas in logic a thought is understood to include nothing else but what depends on thinking and what thinking has brought into existence. It is in these circumstances that thoughts are pure thoughts. The mind is then in its own home element and therefore free. For freedom means that the other thing with which you deal is a second self, so that you never leave your own ground but give the law to yourself. In the impulses or appetites, the beginning is from something else, from something which we feel to be external. In this case, then, we speak of dependence. For freedom, it is necessary that we should feel no presence of something else which is not ourselves. The natural man, whose motions follow the rule only of his appetites, is not his own master, but he as self-willed as he may but he, as self willed as he may, the constituents of his will and opinion are not his own, and his freedom is merely formal. But when we think, we renounce our selfish and particular being, sink ourselves in the thing, allow thought to follow its own course, and if we add anything of our own, we think ill. If in pursuance of the foregoing remarks we consider logic to be the system of the pure types of thought, we find that the other philosophical sciences, the philosophy of I, nature, and the philosophy of mind, take the place, as it were, of an applied logic, metalogic, and that logic is the soul which animates them both. Their problem in that case is only to recognize the logical forms under the shapes they assume in nature and mind. Their problem, their problem in which they'll find a mathematical solution. Their 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 task, not their problem in its other form that we use it. So their problem, their task in that case is only to recognize the logical forms under the shapes they assume in nature and mind, shapes which are only a particular mode of expression from the forms of pure thought. If, for instance, we take the syllogism not as it was understood in the old formal logic, but as its real value, we shall find it gives expression to the law that the particular is the middle term which fuses together the extremes of the universal and the singular. The syllogistic form is a universal form of all things. Everything that exists is a particular, which couples together the universal and the singular. But nature is weak and fails to exhibit the logical forms in their purity. Such a feeble exemplification of the syllogism may be seen in the magnet. In the middle or point of indifference of a magnet, its two poles, however they may be distinguished, are brought into one. Physics also teaches us to see the universal or essence in nature, and the only difference between it and the philosophy of nature is that the latter brings before our mind the adequate forms of the notion in the physical world. It will now be understood that logic is the all animating spirit of all the sciences, and its categories the spiritual hierarchy. They are the heart and center of things, and yet at the same time, they are always on our lips, and apparently at least, perfectly familiar objects. But things thus familiar are usually the greatest strangers. But things thus familiar are usually the greatest strangers. Being, for example, is a category. Being, for example, is a category of pure thought. But to make is an object of investigation never occurs to us. Common fancy puts the absolute far away in a world beyond. The absolute is rather directly before us, so present that so long as we think, we must, though without express consciousness of it, always carry it with us and always use it. Language is the main depository of these types of thought, and one use of the grammatical instruction which children receive is unconsciously to turn their attention to distinctions of thought. Logic is usually said to be concerned with forms only and to derive the material for them from elsewhere. but this only which assumes the logical thoughts are nothing in comparison with the rest of the contents is not the word to use about forms which are the absolutely real ground of everything. Everything else rather is and only compared with these thoughts. To make such abstract forms a problem presupposes in the inquirer a higher level of culture than ordinary. To make such abstract forms a problem presupposes in the inquirer a higher level of culture than ordinary, and to study them in themselves and for their own sake signifies, in addition, that these thought types must be deduced out of thought itself, and their truth or reality examined by the light of their own laws. We do not assume them as data from without, and then define them or exhibit their value and authority by comparing them with the shape they take in our minds. If we thus acted, we should proceed from observation and experience, and should, for instance, say, we habitually employ the term force in such case and such a meaning. A definition like that would be called correct if it agreed with the conception of its object present in our ordinary state of mind. The defect of this empirical method is that a notion is not defined as it is in and for itself, but in terms of something assumed, which is then used as a criterion and standard of correctness. No such test need be applied. We have merely to let the thought forms follow the impulse of their own organic life. To ask if a category is true or not must sound strange to the ordinary mind, for a category apparently becomes true only when it is applied to a given object, and apart from this application, it would seem meaningless to inquire into its truth. But this is the very question on which everything turns. We must, however, in the first place, understand clearly what we mean by truth. In common life, truth means the agreement of an object with our conception of it. We thus presuppose an object to which our conception must conform. In the philosophical sense of the word, on the other hand, truth may be described in general abstract terms as the agreement of a thought content with itself. This meaning is quite different from the one given above. At the same time, the deeper and philosophical meaning of truth can be partially traced even in the ordinary usage of language. Thus, we speak of a true friend, by which we mean a friend whose manner of conduct accords with the notion of friendship. In the same way, we speak of a true work of art. Untrue in this sense means the same as bad or self discordant. In this sense, a bad state is an untrue state, and evil and untruth, and evil and untruth. In this sense, a bad state is an untrue state, and evil and untruth may be said to consist in the contradiction, substituting between the function or notion and the existence of the object. Of such a bad object, we may form a correct representation, but the import of such representation is inherently false. Of these correctnesses, which are at the same time untruths, we may have many in our heads. God alone is the thorough harmony of notion and reality. God alone is the thorough harmony of notion and reality. All finite things involve an untruth. They have a notion and an existence, but their existence does not meet the requirement of the notion. For this reason, they must perish, and then the incompatibility between their notion and their existence becomes manifest. It is in the kind that the individual animal has its notion. and the kind liberates itself from this individuality by death. The study of truth, or as it is here explained to mean, consistency, constitutes the proper problem of logic. In our everyday mind, we are never troubled with questions about the truth of the forms of thought. We may also express the problem of logic by saying that it examines the thoughts of thought touching their capability to hold truth. And the question comes to this: what are the forms of the infinite, and what are the forms of the finite? Usually, no suspicion attaches to the finite forms of thought. They are allowed to pass unquestioned. But it is from conforming to finite categories in thought and action that all deception originates. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for itself. Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion, Encyclopedia Section 24. With these explanations and qualifications, thoughts may be termed objective thoughts, among which are also to be included the forms, which are more especially discussed in common logic, where they are usually treated as forms of conscious thought only. Logic therefore coincides with metaphysics, the science of things set and held in thoughts, thoughts accredited able to express the essential reality of things. Infrasection 3. Truth may be ascertained by several methods, each of which, however, is no more than a form. Experience is the first of these methods, but the method is only a form. It has no intrinsic value of its own, for in experience everything depends upon the mind we bring to bear upon actuality. A great mind is great in its experience, and in the motley play of phenomena at once perceives the point of real significance. The idea is present in actual shape, not something, as it were, over the hill and far away. The genius of Goethe, or Goethe, for example, looking into nature or history, has great experiences, catches sight of the living principle, and gives expression to it. I've heard the name Goethe, I've heard the name Goethe, and I've heard the name Gauth. In Arabic, Gauth is a very high rank among mystics. So Gauth is what a North African would say. Goethe seems more German pronunciation, and so between the two, there is respect. The genius of Ralph or Goethe, for example, looking into nature or history, has great experiences, catches sight of the living principle, and gives expression to it. A second method of apprehending the truth is reflection, which defines it by intellectual relations of condition and conditioned. But in these two modes, the absolute truth has not yet found its appropriate form. The most perfect method of knowledge proceeds in the pure form of thought, and there the attitude of man is one of entire freedom. That the form of thought is the perfect form, and that it presents the truth as it intrinsically and actually is the general dogma of all philosophy. To give a proof of the dogma, there is, in the first instance, nothing to do but show that these other forms of knowledge are finite. The grand skepticism of antiquity accomplished this task when it exhibited the contradictions contained in every one of these forms. That skepticism indeed went further, but when it ventured to assail the forms of reason, it began by insinuating under them something finite upon which it might fasten. All the forms of finite thought will make their appearance in the course of logical development, the order in which they present themselves being determined by necessary laws. Here in the introduction, they can only be unscientifically assumed as something given. In the theory of logic itself, these forms will be exhibited, not only on their negative, but also on their positive side. When we compare the different forms of ascertaining truth with one another, the first of them, immediate knowledge, may perhaps seem the finest, noblest, and most appropriate. It includes everything which the moralists term innocence, as well as religious feeling, simple trust, love, fidelity, and natural faith. The two other forms, first reflective, and secondly, philosophical cognition, must leave that unsought natural harmony behind. And so far as they have this in common, the methods which claim to apprehend the truth by thought may naturally be regarded as part and parcel of the pride which leads man to trust to his own powers for a knowledge of the truth. Such a position involves a thorough going disruption. Such a position involves a thoroughgoing disruption and, viewed in that light, might be regarded as the source of all evil and wickedness, the original transgression. Apparently, therefore, the only way of being reconciled and restored to peace is to surrender all claims to think or know. This lapse from natural unity has not escaped notice, and nations from the earliest times have asked the meaning of the wonderful division of the spirit against itself. No such inward disunion is found in nature. Natural things do nothing wicked. The Mosaic legend of the fall of man has preserved an ancient picture representing the origin and consequences of this disunion. The incidents of the legend form the basis of an essential article of the Creed, the doctrine of original sin in man and his consequent need of succor. Again, man as the universal category, not necessarily individual man as he sees himself. There are beliefs in the East that every man is born, and woman and human is born in a state of absolute obedience to the laws of nature. And it is only through either a lack of training or poor training that he develops or she develops a sense of poor performance or evil in that sense. Otherwise, they do not do anything evil, even if we would say they didn't do anything good. However, man has formed about 6,000 years ago. It's not that mankind is only 6,000 years old, but our current philosophical union is intentionally about 6,000 years old. In that, and right around that number, in that we have agreed that we would all gather together and understand the origin of our species, our of our non-animalistic selves, as starting with this first man, Adam, and Adam means from the ground, and also can mean man. And his original sin and his wife's original sin, or Eve's, our mother's original sin, and the original and the cause of an animal's transgression, who at that point at least, the serpent, if it is an animal, he also transgressed and sinned. It was punished for it. So even an animal, which could have been another man, may have also sinned. So we've agreed that that's our origin. And then we've all kind of traced from there uh, individuals who form a collective picture. So when the discussion is, at least in philosophy, the doctrine of original sin in man, it means that the species, as we've been, at least for 6,000 years, if not for longer, but we unless you have writings from before that time period. We tend to focus on the 6,000 years. That from that beginning period, we had a situation which occurred which caused this state of original sin, and we've used it usefully to measure against our individual selves. So you aren't born with it, but as you are born with the very nature of mankind, Adam and his Adam and Eve and their sin, then you are born with the potential of it. And having just the potential of this evil, within the category of mankind, and starting at this really philosophical point of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and others, we then argue, we see what our first mother and father and our elder brothers, our uncles, we could say, and possibly later on our aunts did, and we compare ourselves from when we're born and we're raised to those people. As mankind, we have shown a propensity to original sin. It is not that you yourself are originally sinful, but you yourself may not have yet an I. And part of philosophy is acquiring that I and overcoming this potential for an original sin as it goes. And again, that doctrine is explained in churches and other places as it is. Or it may be discussed that even if you don't have an original sin, though we all kind of agree that that concept has worked, you have the capacity to fail by not thinking, or not knowing how to think, and not knowing how to bring yourself into an I and to seek out freedom. So I bring that up because when there are certain phrases, which in again the tradition of Dianetics and Scientology are called engrams, which are literally ingrammatical, en grammatical. They are embedded within our grammar uh, as if they're as turn phrases. So, doctrine of original sin, you rarely break that up to the four words that are there. Doctrine of original sin. You hear doctrine of original sin as if it were the word blue. And most people run to that understanding, and rarely do they understand what blue is or doctrine of original sin. But you have a what are called somatic response to it, uh, uh, maybe a emotional. You can taste it, see it, feel it, touch or smell it, um, see it right in front of you, and it just shows up. And so one of the things that I bring up Scientology and Dianetics because Scientology and Dianetics, um, beyond the fame, and fame is kind of part of being successful, it uses the Hegelian model, synthesized by L. Ron Hubbard and others since, to create the person, the ideal Platonic person. And my warning would be that as useful as it is, and it is extremely useful, the doctrine of original sin does apply. And there are people who, it will be a saying, I think the Catholic Church, I'm confirmed as a Catholic personally, and I find it to be extremely useful uh, intellectually, spiritually, and politically to be a confirmed Catholic, even though uh, my blood, my birth religion is Judaism. To confirm or deny something is a helpful way to interact with it, especially if it's the predominant uh, cultural application of religion. You should know what it is. I decided to go through the confirmation process, and I confirmed it. I confirmed that it is in itself true, and going through this process here, we learn what truth is. Um, However, if I told you to walk into your neighborhood cathedral or Catholic church, you may find that it is a difficult situation. You may find that it's wonderful. You may find it difficult. If you walk into your local mosque or local temple or synagogue, even though I believe that the teachings could be beneficial to you, in making you a better person, you may find yourself in a difficult situation. The same thing with Scientology and Dianetics. If I will guarantee you that the methods that Dianetics employs and some of the other technologies are life-saving and essential to reaching some of these goals that we're talking about here about truth. However, if you walk into a certain area, you may find yourself unhappy with some of the people you meet. Uh, and knowing how to separate between the two is currently part of the human experience. So, uh, Doctrine of Original Sin, we're talking about the universal, not necessarily the individual, the each individual I, but the universal. The Mosaic legend of the fall of man has preserved an ancient picture representing the origin and consequence of this disunion. The incidents of the legend form the basis of an essential article of the Creed, the doctrine of original sin in man and his consequent need of succor. It may be well at the commencement of logic to examine the story which treats of the origin and the bearings of the very knowledge which logic has to discuss. For though philosophy must not allow itself to be overawed by religion, or accept the position of existence of sufferance, she cannot afford to neglect these popular conceptions. Sophia, uh, is the she referred to, and she is from a Zoroastrian standpoint. You have Ahura Mazda and Angramayu, and you also then have Sophia. And Philosophia is the brotherly attachment to Sophia, which is wisdom. So she, philosophy. For though philosophy must not allow herself to be overawed by religion or accept the position of existence of sufferance, she cannot afford to neglect these popular conceptions. The tales and allegories of religion, which have enjoyed for thousands of years the veneration of nations, are not to be set aside as antiquated even now. Upon a closer inspection of the story of the fall, we find, as was already said, that it exemplifies the universal bearings of knowledge upon the spiritual life. In its instinctive and natural stage, spiritual life wears the garb of innocence and confiding simplicity. But the very essence of spirit implies the absorption of this immediate condition in something higher. The spiritual is distinguished from the natural, and more especially from the animal life in the circumstance that it does not continue a mere stream of tendency, but sunders itself to self-realization. But this position of severed life has in its turn to be but this position of severed life has in its turn to be suppressed, and the spirit has by its own act to win its way to concord again. The final concord then is spiritual, that is, the principle of restoration is found in thought. Coagula comes from thought, and thought only. The hand that inflicts the wound is also the hand which heals it. Salve coagula, the hand that inflicts the wound is also the hand which heals it. We are told in our story that Adam and Eve, the first human beings, the types of humanity, were placed in a garden where grew a tree of life and a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God, it is said, had forbidden them to eat of the fruit of this latter tree, of the tree of life. For the present, nothing further is said. These words evidently assume that man is not intended to seek knowledge and ought to remain in the state of innocence. Other meditative races, it may be remarked, have held the same belief that the primitive state of mankind was one of innocence and harmony. Now, all this is to a certain extent correct. The disunion that appears throughout humanity is not a condition to rest in, but it is a mistake to regard the natural and immediate harmony as the right state. The mind is not mere instinct. On the contrary, it essentially involves the tendency to reasoning and meditation. Childlike innocence no doubt has in it something fascinating and attractive, but only because it reminds us of what the spirit must win for itself. The harmoniousness of childhood is a gift from the hand of nature. The second harmony must spring from the labor and culture of the Spirit. And so the words of Christ, except ye become as little children, and similar statements, are very far from telling us that we must always remain children. So he goes on to the narrative of Moses. I'll give related, since we're discussing Hegel and we're discussing Central Europe and Northern Europe in German, I will offer a different version of the story of Adam and Eve, though Adam and Eve don't necessarily play an immediate role in it. Uh, God, whatever God may be, may have been walking in the garden in the cool of the day and interacting with his creation, Adam and Eve. However, before Adam and Eve were created, maybe not before they were conceived of, but before they were created other beings. We often, in the Abrahamic tradition, and many others as well, call them Abrahamic tradition, call them angels. In the Central European tradition, they are called well, I will call them the elves. If you know what the angels are called in Aramaic, Elohim, Elo, E-L-O, the O can also be a V, and him is a plural, ES or S. So Elohim is elves, and the elves were created by Aru Aluvetar, uh, who are Aru Alu, some people would say. So the soul of Elf, Aru, soul, or the soul, the primary, the universal soul, Alu, or Aru Elu, the soul of Elv, created Aru Alu Vetar, his avatar, and he created the angels, the elves as well, and set them about designing the heavens, uh, possibly according to a pattern that he laid out, as an architect would offer uh, blueprints and tell you what materials you needed. Maybe he invented some of the materials, maybe he also knows how to build, but he offers blueprints, training, and then sets you to it. And so the elves, the Elohim, were set to build the heaven, and that included the earth. And it said that they were on the earth for a time, and they developed their own cultures and divisions. Um, and there's some debate of there is, like I said, Aru Alu, and that Aru Alu Vetar needed to then challenge the elves and eventually challenge them with mankind. So Aru Elu, as Aru Elu Vetar, his avatar, created Malkor, which may have just been himself. Um, I may have a bias in it, but may have just been himself. And Malkor set to take a third of the elves to himself and set them about a different task than the universal or than the all were about. And eventually mankind was made and will shift back. And so you can find this story in the Similarian of Tolkien, edited by Christopher Tolkien, uh, of the works of his father, J.R.R. Tolkien, the same of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And this is the story you'll find in the similarity. And within the first uh, 20 minutes of reading it, you'll find most of it there. And so the point was, so Hegel says that so do not eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. You can eat the fruit of the tree of life, uh, let's say saccharides with sugars and something that keeps you alive, the tree of life, food, but not the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Why? Because the angels themselves, the Elohim, the elves, don't know what evil is. And so they need to find out. And so a being was created a little lower than the angels, even though in some traditions higher than the angels, depends on which way you look, which was capable of evil. So then the elves, the Elohim, the angels would know what it was and then could then develop systems, of course, with the advice of Elu Aru Vitor, and possibly even Malcor, of what would be the better approach to avoiding evil than what was happening or is happening upon the earth. So they just didn't know what it was. So the fruit of the tree of life was ripe and ready to eat. You could eat it, you can stay alive, and that could either be physical fruit on a tree, uh, plants that were growing wild, or maybe farming that we had later, or there was animal husbandry and other things that we learned to create and eat, a catch from the sea as well. And then the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, the elves, the Elohim, the angels, didn't know what it was necessarily, so it wasn't ripe to eat. And when Adam and Eve, when Eve was convinced, some say by Malchor, some say by Lucifer, some say by the serpent who walked on legs. When Eve was caused to eat it, she became aware. But the thing she became aware of was something negative. What was it? That she had no clothing on. And she brought the fruit to Adam, and he ate it, and he became aware that he was naked, or there were things that he didn't know. And they stitched clothing together. And then they were told later, why did you do that? And then they explained how they learned about it. I blame this woman that you left with me. Oh, the serpent caused me to do it. And I thought that you, Lord, the serpent said, or Malchor said, or Lucifer said, were depriving them of knowledge that they didn't have. And so these were all new experiences. And in that process, a development of what is or is not right was done. If you are growing up in a household, and let's say you are late coming home for the first time ever, it's 9:30, and you are, let's say, a 10th grader, and you come home for the first time ever after 9 o'clock, and you walk in and your father says to you, why are you home so late? I don't have a curfew. What do you mean? You didn't tell me what late was. Well, this is too late. Don't come home this late. For the first time, you've established that there is something called too late, that you've come home too late, and that you're not supposed to come home this late. And you can ask for a time if you want, or you could play it by ear and come home at 9:15 the next time, or just to see how it is. So this is the situation that they were in. And while we believe, most people, that God is omniscient, all-knowing, maybe even he has a plan, a professor also has a plan to teach you something. So he may or she may offer this lecture here and set an exam on it, and then you find that you received a lower mark than you expected. And you ask about it and you say, well, I didn't find this in lecture nor in the reading. How was I supposed to know that this was the method that you wanted? There was no way you could have known until you did it. And now that you know, don't do it again. And as unfair as that seems, and it's seemed for 6,000 years or longer, that is a method of teaching that you've done something. Maybe I've compared it to everyone else's, and in comparison with it, in a bell curve type of way, you've done something poor that I don't like. So don't do it again. This is more my preference as someone within the United Reformed Church, as a Presbyterian, as a by blood a Levite who has to interpret the book of Leviticus. I do that with the readings of Chabad, and I have other responsibilities as a person with a law degree who's worked at law firms and for judges and others. I have come to learn that trial and error are the very first way that we learn, and that the people you go to for answers don't always have them. And so don't forget the elves, the Elohim, the angels who were there to support mankind. They didn't know everything. And some of them knew things that were different. And the great antagonist, Malkor, the Lucifer, uh, he was made of such a nature where he would challenge. And that challenge brings about our understanding of what is or is not. Satan means adversary. And actually, the word adversary is you have an advocate and an adversary. If you're in a courtroom, the advocate is the one with you, and the adversary, the attorney that is on your side, and the adversary is the attorney on the other side. And so your attorney is actually the adversary of the advocate of the other side. So attorneys play the role of angel and demon often, and judges often play the role uh, of arbiter of God or an archangel. And this is the system that we've set up based on what we've known. So uh, it's worth taking this time because so many people have an understanding that it was just God and Adam and Eve, and then the serpent. No, the angels didn't know what evil was. Even and so they had to find out, or they didn't have to find out. They found out, and finding out this is the method that we've been going through. And now others have been sent throughout time, either angels or prophets or philosophers, to explain what is right and what's wrong. And here in the tradition, Hegel is carrying forward from Aristotle, who carries it forward from Solon, who carries it forward from Egyptians and many people, possibly from very before that. They were saying, well, you can know this stuff without necessarily asking someone outside of you, or you should get to the point where you have enough knowledge that you are free from having to depend on someone else to tell you what is right or is wrong. But arguably, it is a rare man or woman, uh, definitely a rare child, who knows what is right or is wrong. A quick a quick note on gender. Um, I believe that so between with gender identity coming from a Native American standpoint, and again, there is diversity in this great ancient place. There have been people coming here for 36,000 years and being here at the same time. But there is a concept of, in French, it's called berdache, and in translation, sometimes it's called two-spirited, where men have been, over the last 6,000 years, assigned certain roles. And women have been assigned certain roles based on their physical gender expression, their cisgender expression. And there are some cisgendered men who have learned the things that a woman traditionally learns after learning the things that he is supposed to do as a man. So he has all of his masculine tasks in place and he learns a woman's role. And there are women who have all of her feminine tasks in place assigned to women who then learn a man's role. And those two people carry forward not only their masculinity, but a certain femininity. So he, a cisgendered male, can replace the wife of another cisgendered man, because he also can do all of her tasks and doesn't interfere with the community. She uh, can replace the husband of a woman because she not only knows all the female tasks, but she knows all the masculine tasks as well. And that may come in terms of dressing as the other gender dresses and at the time when you do it or not. So this is very common, or this notion is where a Native American, myself being Dene Athabaskan, would offer you from my cultural understanding of gender. And I believe in the Western sense of transitioning from cisgendered male to transgendered female, even and from cisgendered female to transgendered male, that the transition point is temporary, however long it lasts, and you will land in the other place. So when I see you, even if you have features of the other gender that are clear, for instance, I will see you as the gender you transitioned into. Then there's an entire community of people who are liminal in their gender and who don't want to operate on terms of what is the responsibility of a man or woman, maybe because we've automated some of that, maybe because their culture doesn't have it, other many cultures on earth. And these people have an they would call an indeterminate gender, and they use terms like they or z or other terms of that nature. And so that is also another way of approaching gender. But the way I described it is, again, you have your role, your cisgendered role, and then you adopt the role of the gender that you are not cisgendered with, and you can then take the position of a person who would have also been in that role, uh, and vice versa. And then I understand the Western sense of completely transitioning from one gender to the other, uh, whether whether just in view, or some people go through prostheses that they will add to themselves. There are prosthetic vaginas, there are prosthetic penises that work fully the way that they would work with some work with them while keeping intact your original genitalia. And there are plastic surgeries, of course, as well. So there are ways of going about it that would still land you as a cisgendered individual, even if you weren't born that gender. And then there is the gender in between or gender queer concept as well. So we can't forget that these other gender identities do exist in addition to those who are in between. So we don't become bigoted in our attempts to be inclusive. To continue the reading, Hegel begins to speak about Moses. In this case, he is speaking about Moses as the conduit and author of the Chumash, are the books that he wrote, which are often called the Torah. And he wrote, and some of it was written uh, by the hand of or by the elemental reality, lightning, or some other method of the God he was speaking to himself. And when he spoke to that God and asked, the God had said to him, Moses, you are in a holy place. Take off your shoes, and showed him a number of, for him, miracles that would take place. His staff becoming as if it were, or maybe even a serpent. His hand, which was darker in coloring, becoming white when he put it into his lapel and brought it out. And some other miracles as well that he was given, just to prove that this was something miraculous that he didn't know. At least according to Arthur C. Clarke, there was a technology being used which he was that he did not understand, and any technology, uh, any significantly advanced technology which you do not understand is indistinguishable from magic. He says, Arthur C. Clarke, or you can all argue that it is in Arabic a mu'jiza, which is specifically a preternatural occurrence, something that breaks the norm, which is supposedly rare or improbable. in its occurrence. These can often be used as convincing to an individual. You're trying to get their attention. And Moses, after being given an assignment, you're going to go down to Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt at the time, Ramses the third, or pardon, Ramses the second, and you're going to tell him to release his captive workers, or this particular community which has been there for some time, for uh, since they were invited in by Joseph, who had become regent of Egypt. They had remained, and it's believed were not being treated very well, or at least it would have been better for them to be in their own land, my ancestors. And so you're going to go down and tell him to release them into your care. And Moses said, well, as we discussed categories earlier, this leader, he's considered a hero among the humans, or he's a daemon, or an angel. In some way, he is divine, and he has a certain rank or category. And Moses a had committed a mistake that made him not in the best light in front of the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh at least may not have been known to be lenient to that mistake. And so Moses asked this illumination uh, that was upon a bush, whether it was a flame or some other type of illumination. It could be. I'm looking at my Motorola mobile phone right now, and it has a blaring white screen. What is that illumination? But I know it's working that way. He asked, uh, "Who do I say sent me?" And the being answered, um, in effect, "I am that I am. I am that I am." Meaning, I am the specific I am. I am the uh, essential importance. I am the I that we've been discussing with a being attached to it. I, the essential being. I am the universal being. I am the model by which all I's and beings attribute their own I's and beings. And therefore, I have a rank above and beyond uh, the Pharaoh himself, and I can command him through you. And so this was what was established, this kind of a logical connection. I am that I am. And uh, there are, in English and French have overlapping words, some of which are truly the same. Application and applique, I believe, are the same word. But then there are false friends as well, words that don't mean the same thing. I can't think of an example at the moment. In this case, the word that I'm focusing on in I am, that I am, is the word that. And that may have come all the way up from this time period. That, T-H-A-T, signifies is an identifiable being, something that I can think of and also uh, perceive as real. And in Arabic, the word is D-H-A-T, but they're pronounced very similarly. That versus that. A different place. You start further along the tip of your tongue than you would with the TH. And so and these placements on the tongue are also known in Eastern languages, where you place your teeth or your tongue in relation to everything else in your mouth, or where a letter originates. So that is the essential reality. I am that. I am the essential reality. I am. So you have a full sentence there. I am the essential reality. I am. I am the essential reality, uh, which is personal, and a being. So I'm not an abstraction. The abstraction is the essential reality. He could be also that, but he also has a being. So this is what was offered to Moses as an explanation of what's your rank? Who are you? Why should I listen to you and not the boss of this land? Well, my essential reality is provably greater than his essential reality and would eventually need to be shown in the warned of plagues, which if you cease your objection, Pharaoh, and allow me to take this group of people with me who I have a relationship with, then these difficulties you're facing will end. So this was a negotiation strategy offered to Moses as a mediator or intermediator between him and Pharaoh without resorting to war necessarily. It's a different type of negotiation. I will imperil you this way, uh, unless there's war. And as far as how those things occurred, certain things like comets are cyclical, and they may have been known to occur at that moment. It doesn't mean they're any less divine. It's just that this was a time period on Earth when, let's say, certain ice melted and released certain pathogens, or every year in the Middle East, which includes Egypt. There is something called the Hamasine. The Hamasine is a period of a Hamasine of five, or a period of 50 days in which there's a great sandstorm. And in Egypt, that sandstorm could last just, for a few days of that 50, but there's sand everywhere. And it mixes in with a lot of other burning, if there's burning cement, or there's cement being created, and some of it's whipped up into the sky. There are sugar cane that is being, uh, some of it's being burned because of its excess, and that's being whipped into the sky, or after the sugar is extracted from the cane. The cane isn't useful, it'll be burned, and so some of it has sugar in it, and that's whipped into the sky, and so you have this ominous orange glow. If you're not from there, I remember the first time I was in it, I had assumed the worst. This was a time of uh, the second war in Iraq, and I assumed that it had spread to Egypt at that point because of what it looked like and what I had seen on uh, video. I called around, and once I was able to get someone, they said, "No, this is a sandstorm." So I knew what it was. So the plagues, or the various afflictions that occurred, may have also been instructed to occur and caused, or they may have just been cyclical, and this was the time for it. And Moses, having been a priest of Thoth, PTH, or Ptah, people say, who is an Egyptian god, but he is the creator God, the God who created everything. So, and that was his only temple that he attended. So it's effectively the same being who called him in the wilderness. He very likely had privileged knowledge of the seasonal occurrences of certain calamities, and may have known, even though Ramses II himself didn't know, or better, even though the people didn't know, even if Ramses II did know that these things were going to happen, and to announce them publicly, to announce them in the media, to announce them at court the way he did, and to see them occur, was motivating to releasing those who were descended from Jacob into the hands of Moses, and to just be able to leave and head out, either eventually to the Sinai Peninsula and into what is now Israel today, and a greater area. Some people went north into what is now Ukraine. Others went south into what is Yemen, and some others got on ships and made it to Europe and to southern Europe and to even as far as Ireland. And it's believed that some would have made it over to Newfoundland as well, and maybe even eventually other directions. So people spread out, but a lot of them were counted and stayed in the wilderness for 40 years and produced more. Where they ate the provisions of the Sinai Peninsula, many wild animals and plants and other things were there. Bird fell from the sky, and everything they ate and sacrificed was counted by the Levitical my ancestors, the Levites, they would be asked to bring whatever they killed and sacrifice to the Lord to the temple uh, for uh, for a sacrifice as instructed, but also as a method of keeping account of uh, what they'd eaten, how they were tending to the land, and there may have been reports sent back to Egypt about that, or they may have just kept it as an environmental concern. So again, we back to the narrative. Again, we find in the narrative of Moses that the occasion which led man to leave his natural unity is attributed to solicitation from without. The serpent was the tempter, but the truth is that the step into opposition, the awakening of consciousness, follows from the very nature of man. And the same history repeats itself in every son of Adam. The serpent represents likeness to God as consisting in the knowledge of good and evil, and it is just this knowledge in which man participates when he breaks with the unity of his instinctive being and eats of the forbidden fruit. The first reflection of awakened consciousness in men told them that they were naked. This is a naive and profound trait, but the sense of shame bears evidence to the separation of man from his natural and sensuous life. The beasts never get so far as this separation, and they feel no shame. And it is in the human feeling of shame that we are to seek the spiritual and moral origin of dress, compared with which the merely physical need is a secondary matter. Again, in the concept of religion, especially religious clergy, there is a notion of vestment, and that what you wear, if you wear a beautiful, some priests wear the all black with the white uh, collar, and that distinguishes them as priests, and people look and have a certain relationship with them. There are others who wear uh, white robes and purple or gold or other talisman on top of them, and that also creates a certain look. Cardinals were red, and so being clothed as opposed to naked offers you certain privileges. And the angels or the elves may have themselves had on clothing that gave a certain impression. And once uh, the knowledge of good and evil, the tree was eaten, or they were given certain instruction, Adam and Eve became aware that they did not have vestments to wear. Whether they were fully naked or not, they didn't have the beautiful robes of the peacock, for instance, or of a bear or some others. They were naked in that they didn't see what distinguished them from those fur and feather havers. And so they may have desired to be more impressive. And to desire to be more impressive can cause shame, but is also a sign that you seek to gain something from an outward example, or from an outward trait that you create yourself versus that you are born with innately. Next comes the curse, as it is called, which God pronounced upon man. The prominent point is that curse turns chiefly on the contrast between man and nature. Man must work in the sweat of his brow, and woman bring forth in sorrow. As to work, it is the result of the disunion, it is also the victory over it. The beasts have nothing more to do but to pick up the materials required to satisfy their wants. Man, on the contrary, can only satisfy his wants by himself, producing and transforming the necessary means. Thus, even in these outside things, man is dealing with himself. Now, that's often how it's said that the animals go around and find the birds go out from their nest and they come back with food. Certain other animals go out hunting and they come back with food and feed their young. Mankind has to produce for himself what it wants. And others can say that mankind has the opportunity to produce variety in what he or she wants in terms of eating. Or humankind has that ability, and the diversity of things, including our technologies that we have. These are beautiful privileges, not burdens. The burden is in having to do it. And so why? So I'm saying this like, no, it's actually a very good thing that we get to have produce and make variety. It is because, and this goes back to the Jewish understanding, not really Judeo-Christian understanding, that wouldn't it be wonderful to have all the things we've acquired in terms of technology and not have to produce them? Wouldn't it be wonderful to go back to the state of the animals in the sense that we have all of our theories and technologies and production, but it is automated and we don't have to do it? And so the ideal in a Jewish understanding of the world is that we continue to advance, but we don't have to toil to produce. And this is where robotics and artificial intelligence and virtual reality come into play, is that it's not that we don't have to toil, it's that mankind has worked very hard over our, let's say, from more recent terms, our 6,000 year period, and very much longer period of time that we've been on Earth. And since we've worked so hard, uh, let us now appreciate what we collectively have done and approach a point where we don't have to work and we have others, hopefully non mankind, robots, AI, other type of things, doing it for us. And we can relax and leisure and sit around and discuss Hegel all day. That you don't need to be at a university, or it's great to be at a university and paid by a university. It's great to be a YouTube contributor. It's great to use your time while applying for work, as I am, to contribute to society in some way, working, toiling, making sure this is there. But isn't it great that once I do this, assuming it's something that you prefer, that you don't have to do it? You don't have to record it. Somebody may want to go back and record it without all this dicta, but in general, it would have been done already and doesn't have to be reproduced. That's the ideal. That's where the negative speech comes from. And oh, woe is us. We have to toil to create. Well, until we don't. But we keep the negative tone so we remember that we want to get to a point where we don't have to toil. The story does not close with the expulsion from paradise. We are further told God said, behold, Adam is become as one of us, to know good and evil. Knowledge is now spoken of as divine, and not as before as something wrong and forbidden. Such words contain a confutation of the idle talk that philosophy pertains only to the finitude of the mind. Philosophy is knowledge, and it is through knowledge that man first realizes his original vocation to be the image of God. When the record adds that God drove man out of the Garden of Eden to prevent their eating of the tree of life, it only means that on the natural side, certainly man is finite and moral, but in knowledge infinite. We all know the theological dogma that man's nature is evil, tainted with what is called original sin. While while we accept the dogma, we must give up the setting of incident which represents original sin as consequent upon an accidental act of the first man. For the very notion of spirit is enough to show that man is evil by nature, and it is an error to imagine that he could ever be otherwise. To such extent as man is and acts like a creature of nature, his whole behavior is what it ought not to be. For the spirit it is in for the spirit it is a duty to be free and to realize itself by its own act. Nature is for man only the starting point which he has to transform. The theological doctrine of original sin is a profound truth, but modern enlightenment prefers to believe that man is naturally good and that he acts right so long as he continues true to nature. The hour when man leaves the path of mere natural being marks the difference between him, a self conscious agent, and the natural world. But this schism, though it forms a necessary element in the very notion of spirit, is not the final goal of man. It is to this state of inward breach that the whole finite action of thought and will belongs. In that finite sphere, man pursues ends of his own and draws from himself the material of his conduct. While he pursues these aims to the uttermost, while his knowledge and his will seek himself, his own narrow self apart from the universal, he is evil, and his evil is to be subjective. We seem at first to have a double evil here, but both are really the same. Man, as so far as he is spirit, is not the creature of nature, and when he behaves as such and follows the cravings of appetite, he wills to be so. The natural wickedness of man is therefore unlike the natural life of animals. A mere natural life may be more exactly defined by saying that the natural man, as such, is an individual. For nature is every part for nature in every part is in the bonds of individualism. Thus, when man wills to become a creature of nature, he wills in the same degree to be an individual simply. Yet against such impulsive and appetitive action, due to the individualism Due to the individualism of nature, there also steps in the law or general principle. This law may either be an external force or have the form of divine authority. So long as he continues in his natural state, man is in bondage to the law. It is true that among the instincts and affections, it is true that among the instincts and affections of man, there are social or benevolent inclinations, love, sympathy, and others, reaching beyond his selfish isolation. But so long as there but so long as these tendencies are instinctive, their virtual universality of scope and purport is vitiated by the subjective form, which always allows free play to self-seeking and random action. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for Itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion, Final, Encyclopedia, Section 25, the term objective thoughts indicates the truth which is to be the absolute object of philosophy, and not merely the goal at which it aims. But the very expression cannot fail to suggest an opposition, to characterize and appreciate which is the main motive of the philosophical attitude of the present time, and which forms the real problem of the question about truth and our means of ascertaining it. If the thought forms are vitiated by the fixed antithesis, in essence, if they are only of a finite character, they are unsuitable for the self centered universe of truth. And truth can find no adequate receptacle in thought. Such thought, which can produce only limited and partial categories, and I proceed by their means, is what is the stricter and I proceed by their means, is what, in the stricter sense of the word, is termed understanding. The finitude, further, of these categories lies in 2 points. Firstly, they are only subjective, and the antithesis of an objective permanently clings to them. Secondly, they are always of restricted content, and so persist in antithesis to one another, and still more to the absolute. In order more fully to explain the position and import in order more fully to explain the position and import here attributed to logic, the attitudes in which thought is supposed to stand to objectivity will next be examined by way of further introduction. In my Phenomenology of the Spirit, which on that account was at its publication described as the first part of the system of philosophy, the method adopted was to begin with the first and simplest phase of mind, immediate consciousness, and to show how that stage gradually of necessity worked onward to the philosophical point of view, the necessity of that view being proved by the process. But in these circumstances, it was impossible to restrict the quest to the mere form of consciousness, for the stage of philosophical knowledge is the richest in material and organization. And therefore, as it came before us in the shape of a result, it presupposed the existence of the concrete formation of consciousness, such as individual and social morality, arts, and religion. In the development of consciousness, which at first sight appears limited to the point of form merely, there is thus at the same time included the development of the matter or of the objects discussed in the special branches of philosophy. But the latter process must, so to speak, go on behind consciousness, since those facts are the essential nucleus which is raised into consciousness. The exposition accordingly is rendered more intricate because so much that properly belongs to the concrete branches is prematurely dragged into the introduction. The survey which follows is the survey which follows in the present work has even more the inconvenience of being only historical and inferential in its method, but it tries especially to show how the questions men have proposed outside the school on the nature of knowledge, faith, and the like, questions which they imagine to have no connection with abstract thoughts are really reducible to the simple categories which first get cleared up in logic. End of chapter 2.